Hey everyone, it's Michael Shermer here. Here's a cool idea. If you want to support the show and the Skeptic Society, we are a 501c3 nonprofit science, educational, and research organization. Here is a cool idea to make a donation. If you go to bignerve.com/skeptic, that's Big Nerve, BIGNERV, just like it sounds, .com/skeptic, you can make a donation to support the show and the society. And in return, I will review something you're working on. It could be an article, an idea, an argument, or anything else you're trying to refine, and you'd like my opinion on it or some feedback to shape it up. I have been now taking guests' contributions to my Substack Skeptic column because you're supposed to post stuff much more regularly than I do. And so I'm always looking for new content, as we are in the print and digital edition of the magazine. So go to bignerve.com/skeptic, make a donation to the show for the show and the society, and directly ask for my feedback. I will be reviewing these as they come in. So check it out, bignerve.com/skeptic. All right. Thanks for listening. Here's the show. My guest today is Marc Hauser. He's an educator, neuroscientist, and founder of Risk Eraser, a program that helps at-risk kids lead healthier lives. He's a former professor of evolutionary biology and psychology at Harvard University and the author of over 300 papers. His books include Wild Minds, What Animals Really Think, Moral Minds, The Nature of Right and Wrong. I loved that book when I was researching my Good and Evil book, I think is when I read that. Evolicious, Cruelty Equals Desire plus Denial. And the new book, here it is, Vulnerable Minds, The Harm of Childhood Trauma and the Hope of Resilience, based on his work over the past decade. It's just out today. We'll post this on the day that the book is released. I think that's what. No, it's already out now, I think. So, actually, so we'll release this fairly quick. Marc, nice to see you. How you doing?
Nice to see you, Michael. Great to be here.
Where are you?
I'm on Cape Cod in Falmouth, in Massachusetts.
Oh my God, you're one of those coastal elites.
Coastal elites, just like you.
That's right. I'm on the other coast. I'm on the left coast. We're both on the left coast. Yeah, this is a super interesting subject here. Let me just read from the book itself, your own intro here, why you wrote the book, and then you can expand on this. I wrote this book listening to different voices of suffering from adversity. I am the son of a father who lived as a child in Nazi-occupied France, away from his parents. I'm the father of two extraordinary daughters. My eldest suffered the pain of my divorce, while my youngest was adopted from an early age from an orphanage where she was deprived of many core needs. I'm a husband married to a wonderful woman who grew up in poverty and lost her father at an early age to manic depression. I'm a scientist and educator who has worked with hundreds of children scarred by different types of adversity. As a child, I was badly bullied for a period of 2 years, and as an adult, I experienced an extended period of adversity that some readers may be aware of. I stepped down from my professorship at Harvard University because of research misconduct. This was painful for myself, my students and colleagues, my family and friends. But I've learned much from this experience, knowledge that has led to the second chapter of my career, dedicated to helping children with trauma and different disabilities learn, grow, and enjoy what life has to offer. Working with these children, as well as with their teachers, therapists, and doctors, has certainly been the most meaningful and rewarding work of my life. Wow. Incredible confessions there, Marc. Just start with the childhood bullying, because I'm pretty sure I was bullied. I think it was 8th grade. This big guy kept, every single day, he would slug me in the arm whenever I walked by. And I don't know why I never said anything to teachers. I never told my parents. I just kind of avoided this guy. If I saw him now, I would just really want to give him a knuckle sandwich. I mean, just, God damn it, this guy. How come I didn't do anything? Anyway, what happened to you, and what can we learn from those kind of stories?
Yeah, so probably similar in age to you. So I was about 13, and for me, it was this kind of thuggish mafioso of 3 boys. And probably like you, I remember their names, all 3 of them. I remember what they looked like. And interestingly, many years ago, I was having a chat on other matters with Noam Chomsky, who at the time I think was 90 or so. And I mentioned my bullying experience, and he was able to articulate the name of the bully who bullied him when he was about 9 years old. And that was, 81 years ago or whatever. And so they leave these kind of impressions, which is really kind of incredible. I think most stories of people bullying are like that. Mine was very, very difficult. And for a while, I decided my dad, I said, I'm not going to school. And my mom said, well, we're going to call the principal. I said, no, 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 no. That would be the worst. That would be the worst. Like, it'd be horrible. So my dad actually met me for lunch for 2 months every day. He was a very distinguished physicist. And he took time off from lunch, met me, and supported me until one day he said, look, this is what happened to me during the war, during France. You got to fight back. Even if you get crushed, you got to fight back. So one day, I figured I couldn't take all 3 of them on. I could barely take on one of them. But while one of the big ones was turned around, I slugged him, and it was like a fly bouncing off the window. Did nothing. I started crying, and he goes, why are you crying? And I said, because you beat me up every single day. I can't take it anymore. He goes, all right, we'll stop. And I was like, what? So completely bizarre, but it worked to some extent. But just like you, I kind of wish the worst for them. And then, make a long story short, several years ago, I looked them up and all 3 had died.
Did? Oh my God.
I did. All 3 due to different causes. One with hit an accident, 2 of like cancer disease. But I was like, there we go.
Feels like cosmic justice.
Total cosmic justice. Absolutely. Yeah.
That's wild. Yeah. So I presume most bullied kids don't say anything. They just hold it inside.
I think they do. Or, there's a lot of research on bullying, and, things bifurcate. And it's an interesting question about why, but some people who are bullied become bullies. So it's kind of a learned helplessness kind of thing where they unleash on others. Some keep it quiet just because of the fear of greater repercussions, or for seeming to be weak. And I think ultimately, like I assume what we'll talk about a little bit later on today, those who make it through ultimately have a support system the way I did with my parents.
Yeah. Well, certainly now, since bullying is out in the open and you're supposed to turn people in and say something to the adults.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's declining. Before we get to the other thing, the Harvard thing, your father was a physicist. I don't think I knew that. I'm always interested in how lives turn out. You became a scientist. Your father was a physicist. What did your mother do? And why did you follow your father's footsteps, sort of?
Well, it's interesting. I followed both parents' footsteps. And so my father hated teaching. He was a research physicist. So I was born in Cambridge because he was a grad student at Harvard in physics. And so, he met my mom actually in Troy, New York. And she was a teacher. She was a director of a Montessori school. So I really am kind of the blended inheritance of my parents who loves teaching and loves science. My dad went from Harvard as a grad student to Bell Laboratories in the heydays when, that was more powerful than the Pentagon. And so we kind of grew up near Murray Hill, New Jersey. And he was a research scientist until the bitter end when Bell Labs, divested and kind of ended that. But he was one of the last scientists standing when Bell Labs ended. So, I remember when I was interested in going into science, he goes, you're just going into science because I'm a scientist. And I said, no, I really like biology. And then we'd have these big debates, ones you'll appreciate as a historian of science, of who was greater, Einstein or Darwin? And then for a long time, he's like, that's not even a close contest. Clearly it's Einstein. And he's come around now thinking, no, Darwin was much more important.
Oh, that's really funny. Yeah. Since you write about multi-generational effects of traumatic childhood experiences, your father, grew up in Nazi-occupied France. Did you ever think, well, I wonder if this spills over into me, not just through my upbringing, but through genes or epigenetics or whatever?
I don't think I had much at the time, in part because my father is by far, and this is in the book, one of the most resilient people I've ever met in my life. So, if he experienced any trauma, he certainly didn't wear it on any of his sleeves. And my home was just an incredibly warm and nurturing environment. And, as I've come to work more and more with children who did not have what I had growing up, the more I realized that there's the absolute beauty of the parenting I got from both my mom and my dad. And so the trauma certainly wasn't carried through in any way that I experienced as a child. And although we were told endless stories, and certainly when my father's mom, my grandmother, was alive, the two of them together would tell stories. And so I learned a lot about their experiences through those stories, but it never came through as, a traumatic response in the sense of, scarring in that way. And he's 92 today. And like you, who's, I know, a fanatic bicyclist, he's ridden all the Tour de France routes on his bicycle. He lives in Chamonix in France. And so
Really?
he's an avid athlete. He's done, he's climbed all the peaks in Chamonix and Mont Blanc. And, he's an incredible athlete with major robustness.
Wow. How old is your dad?
92.
Oh my God, he's still moving. See, keep moving.
Yeah, keep moving. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I know Lance Armstrong, and I've talked to him actually on his own podcast. I talked to him about rehabilitating oneself, and kind of fessing up to what you did and come clean and start over. I believe in, second chances for sure. Part of the problem is the negativity bias. One of the examples of the research on that, as you know, is that people will remember the worst thing you ever did, and that can erase decades of good work. Like the preacher who does nothing but good work, and then he has an affair, or he embezzles from the church, or he does one thing, he screws up, and that's it. That's all people remember. It's really unfortunate. So anyway, what happened to you at Harvard? Let me just read what the Wikipedia page thing says. 2007, Harvard announced an internal investigation of alleged scientific misconduct by Hauser. On August 2010, Michael Smith, Dean of Harvard's Faculty of Arts and Sciences, released a statement confirming that an internal investigation had found Hauser guilty of 8 counts of misconduct. Okay, so what happened?
Well, so, that was a painful period in my life. And as you probably know, and many people may know, I've stayed quiet on this topic ever since it happened, which, I resigned from my position at Harvard in basically 2011. And, maybe for people who don't know, I was not fired from my job. I was not asked by Dean Smith at the time to leave. That was not what the decision was. So I still had my job. People may also know that what that resulted in was one paper was retracted, and the others had either been corrected, kind of during or before the case, or there were papers that never saw the light of day. And so, I learned a great deal about what it meant to rush through things and be sloppy in some ways, and what the costs of not paying attention to my own specific work and my guidance of other students when I had a very large lab. And so that was a painful experience to go through. But part of the reason for staying quiet as I have was to protect the students, to make sure that they were not hurt by this experience, although, of course, at the time, they were emotionally very badly hurt by what happened. And I, of course, spoke to all of them individually. I, in some ways, felt that how I acted was actually, by protecting them, worked out well. Most of my students, I would say all of my students who were there at the time, have landed in some of the best jobs that there are on the planet. And they are now very distinguished scientists. And so they, people like Laurie Santos, who I'm sure you're aware of, who's at Yale and has got her own podcast, and Fiery Cushman, who's at Harvard, Tecumseh Fitch, and a bunch of other incredible scientists who went through my lab. Those were very, very difficult. And I tried to do my best to protect the students who were involved in it. I had a very, very large lab and many, many students. On the science part, and I think this is, to me, the important piece, or an important piece, I should say, is there was, when misconduct happens, of course, one of the biggest damages, there's two, at least to me, great damages that occur during misconduct. One is it potentially leads other scientists to chase down results that are basically false. And then, of course, secondly, there's a tie to that of wasted grant money, that people are funding is going to be wasted because you haven't done something that's correct. You've either made something up, or you've distorted, or whatever it is that's led to work being retracted. So the one paper that was retracted because of a significant error we had in the design of the experiment, what is at least happy news for me, in one sense, is that paper has been independently replicated twice now by different labs. And so although the result we reported was false because it was based on an incorrect design feature of our experiment, other labs went on to replicate the result that was actually reported to begin with. So at least in terms of what I think can be the really nasty implications of research misconduct is people go down a wild goose chase, and that people's careers are hurt, like students of mine or collaborators. That did not happen. So I'm at least glad that the fallout wasn't bad the way it could have been.
Was some of the sloppiness, et cetera, due to the publish or perish environment? That is not the bad apple, but the bad apple barrel. The entire system is set up in such a way to incentivize cutting corners. We saw this with the replication crisis that came out years after your incident, in which, like the Daryl Bem experiment, which he only reported certain findings and so on. And now it turns out maybe a third to a half of all published papers in psychology, particularly social psychology, and those priming experiments, not to mention medical experiments, probably should never have been published. Why were they published? Well, p-hacking and selective reporting, file drawer problem, those sorts of things.
I blame myself for something else. I don't think it's that. I mean, so as you know, a good chunk of my work was on non-human animals. The rest of it was on the moral psychology field, which was a booming and blossoming field. I blame myself for something different, which is rather than publish or perish. I had published a lot. I had tenure, so that wasn't the issue. At least for me, it wasn't. I'm not saying it's not an issue for other people. I think for me, it was getting wrapped up in trying to do way too many things, including writing books for the public, as you have, that I certainly got, not roped into, guys enjoyed it, but, became part of the John Brockman stable, thanks to my, good friend Steve Pinker at the time and Dan Dennett, who encouraged me to write. That was very attractive, of course, because of the attention and because I enjoy writing for the public and enjoy public speaking. But unlike many of those who have been successful at writing for the public, like yourself and Steve Pinker and Dan Dennett, they didn't have big labs. I did. I had at any given time 20 undergraduates, 6 or 7 grad students, 3 or 4 postdocs, multiple research assistants, an animal facility, just a lot going on that had to be managed. And I compromised on the care it took to do those things. And that's where I think things went south. And so that's what I blame. It was less the need to publish than it was the need to be more careful with what was going on so that things could be checked more carefully, which I just didn't do.
I seem to recall there were some issues about interpreting videos of monkeys turning, I think it was a mirror test or something like that. And it wasn't clear what the operational definition of a hit, it turned this far this way, so you count it as this instead of that, something like that.
Yeah, I mean, so the the mirror test work that we had done, that wasn't part of the investigation. We had actually published. It wasn't so much a retraction as a failure to replicate. We actually published a failure to replicate. So we came out and said, look, we ran this again and we did not get a replication. The problem with animal studies, which, you and some of your listeners may be aware of, is that unlike in the field of, let's say, social psychology, where the replication crisis has occurred, that's a field where you have, potentially thousands and thousands of subjects at your availability. I had, 12 cotton top tamarins. There's just, there's just so much you can do. So it's almost like doing neuropsychology, where you have a small set of individuals where you have to run multiple tests on the same individual. Now, like any other study that's done where you've got observations of behavior, we had certainly very well, I thought, designed methods for looking at biases so people would score the tapes blind to the conditions often. They wouldn't hear the audio when it was an acoustic study. Similarly for all the work on moral psychology, which, that work, there's been no issues ever from anybody that I know of failure to replicate those. There's been differences in views, as you know, about how to think about our moral sense. But those are theoretical positions. They don't hinge on, the nature of replication or anything like that. So there's no question that I think that the animal field, at least, has been challenged by the fact that you've got A, small populations of animals, B, often unique populations that are often tested and retesting multiple times. One of the reasons why B.F. Skinner worked on rats and pigeons because they were effectively disposable, and you could have thousands of them. Once you start working on chimpanzees and elephants and monkeys the way we did, you're now talking about a very constrained, finite population that will often be reused for multiple experiments over and over and over again. And other kinds of effects can then enter into what happens with the data.
Yeah. But that word, last question on this subject, that word misconduct is pretty broad. Yeah. The worst version of it is fabrication of data. Was there anything like that?
Well, my interpretation is no. There were not. I think it was a case of sloppiness, neglect and care of rigorous methods that should have been more in place on my own part, and failure to check certain things. And again, I think in one sense, I take the full responsibility for what happened, which includes, as I mentioned, this one case that was basically retracted. All the other cases were followed up by replications and published in the journals to show that the data was upheld. But I think from my end, unlike, for example, some of the cases that have been reported recently in social psychology of fabrication, where there's been no replications or follow-ups, that has not happened in my case. The work has been followed up independently by other labs and continued. My students have all gone on who have published with me dozens and dozens of papers to continue that work and extend it in important directions. So I think that, to me, is an important piece as far as the potentially negative impact on the science, which I care about deeply.
Okay, transition to your current work. You report all the research on the physiological effects on the body and brain of stressful events. When you were going through that, were you losing sleep? Did you feel like stress hormones coursing through your body where you're just not feeling yourself for a long period of time? And if so, what effects did that have?
Yeah. So part of my motivation for writing the book was that I was experiencing children who come from these traumatic backgrounds and the impact it has on them, as well as the teachers and nurses and doctors and clinicians that work with these kids. So I was already exposed at some level to, 13, 14 years of working with children like this, as well as some of the work that we started about 3 years ago, which is working in East Africa on children who have been abandoned. So a very large orphan population. Kenya, for example, where we're working, has about 3 million orphans in just one country of 50 million people. Sub-Saharan Africa has 54 million orphans. These are just unbelievable numbers. We are working with the biggest slum in all of Africa called Kibera, which is about 1 million people in 2 square miles. So you can just imagine the poverty and the challenges that these people have, and yet incredible work that's being done to help these individuals. So, of course, a lot of that was already in me experientially from the work that we're doing. But then, of course, adding into it all the work on sexual abuse of children, physical abuse of children, war, and of course, the absolute horror for me was realizing that when the attack in Gaza on October 7th happened, I had a chapter, which in the book on war, and the opening paragraph of that chapter was a bomb that hit Gaza in 2021. And so it was just, of course, heartbreaking to go, here we go again. And then, of course, the bizarre irony in some sense is that some of the most striking research, scientific, comes from Ruth Feldman, who's a neurobiologist who works on the children in Gaza and the impact of war on both development and mothers. So, I had to, of course, find my own resilience, but what drives me is the absolute desire and evidence that children who've been exposed to this can be turned around, they can recover, they can build resilience, they can go forward. So, buoyed by the good responses is what kind of got me through a lot of it.
Yeah, certainly. And what you're doing now, I think, is actually way more important than what you were doing before, even though I was way more interested in that subject because I love all those intellectual topics. But, that's pretty, Ivy League, again, Brockman Stable. Let's talk about great ideas with Dan Dennett and Steve Pinker. Yeah, nothing's more fun than that. But my God, just millions and millions of children that are suffering. Okay, one of the things I'm interested in, again, how lives turn out. And another thing I've been playing with is the unpredictability of human behavior, how hard it is to predict any one person. Like you can say, these are the proxies for suicide, but can you tell me that guy right there is going to commit suicide or not? No, you can't. So I've been writing about this fragile families study that you're familiar with here. I'll just read what I wrote here. The prediction problem was poignantly exposed in a massive study in which 160 teams of social scientists were provided with detailed data collected over 15 years on 4,200 at-risk families from the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study database. They were tasked with predicting 6 life outcomes, for example, child GPA, family material hardship, parental eviction or employment, based on various causal variables such as employment, income, education, health, environment, relationship with extended kin, marriage attitudes, fatherhood, father-mother relationships, interviews, and in-home assessments. The research teams employed not only the usual statistical tools and methods of all social scientists are trained to use, but AI machine learning programs as well. The results were underwhelming, to say the least. Here's the summary. Even though the fragile family data included thousands of variables collected to help scientists understand the lives of these families, participants were not able to make accurate predictions for the holdout cases. Okay, transition to your book here. I'm just going to read the opening sentence here from the book because it says this quite well. After his grandmother died, 5-year-old LJ lived a nomad's life. He wandered with his mother from house to house, sleeping on couches, alarmed by gunshots, raging parties, police sirens, and drug deals. LJ's mother was only 16 years old when he was born, and he never met his father, a part-time boyfriend with a substantial criminal record. Year after year, LJ missed more school days than he attended. By his 9th birthday, LJ had experienced a wealth of adversity: physical neglect, gang violence, poverty, home displacement, and the absence of a father. LJ was robbed of an early childhood. As LJ entered the 4th grade, his life changed. An athletic coach noticed his chaotic home environment and offered a more stable, nurturing alternative. LJ moved in with his coach. He thrived, turning chronic absenteeism from school into perfect attendance and absolute domination on the basketball court. This is the story of LeBron James. Oh, my God. Okay. Wow. All right. So, in other words, certainly you could take a cohort and all those variables and go, on average, the average kid in that group, it has a 20% or 50% or 80% less chance of being a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, whatever. But that guy right there, that kid right there, you have no idea if he's going to be LeBron James or what. Yes. Why is that?
Well, I think I think that's a really nice way to kind of launch into my book in some ways, because it has very significant implications, I think, on certain policy issues, which we can come to a little bit. But the big question that the book begins to address, and the science is only beginning to come out now, is it's turned out to really be virtually impossible to predict who are going to be the resilient ones and who are going to be the vulnerable ones. So one way to start our conversation is the following. So let's imagine a scale which goes from vulnerable on the left to resilient on the right. Where you are on that scale starts off with your biology. So your biology is going to place you somewhere on that scale just based on the biology. And we're learning more and more about what that biology looks like. There are certain aspects of how the frontal lobes, for example, develop in terms of things like attention and working memory and self-regulation and planning. And it seems that some individuals, just due to the biology, are going to be on the more resilient aspect of that piece with a stronger system. And it turns out that if you compare, and these are adult populations who have experienced the same kinds of adversity during childhood, so you're having a population with similar kinds of adversity, some of those end up with significant mental health problems and others do not. So let's think of those as the vulnerable versus the resilient ones. The ones who end up more seemingly protected from the adversity are those that have stronger frontal lobe functioning, executive functioning. So something about that is protective of the adversity. Now, no one can say, okay, you at birth have been given a gift. You're more likely to be able to deal with this. You, however, have not been given that gift. We need to intervene early to you to give you the protective gear to help you insofar as you may experience adversity. So that is just beginning in some of the animal work, tying back to my earlier work. Some of the animal work where you can manipulate, of course, the environments as well as the biology are beginning to pinpoint some of the circuitry that is going to contribute to being either more vulnerable or resilient. But you're 100% right. We can't say, you, Michael Shermer, you got the gift of biology, and so you were protected. I certainly got parents who were there and supported for me from day one, but I may have also inherited part of my dad's resilience in biology. No, I don't know.
Yeah, interesting, because let's take the case of LeBron James. Obviously, he's massively naturally gifted as an athlete, which really I think has to extrapolate to most other areas of life. I mean, he's just great. Right. So his physiology is probably 6 sigma away from the mean above all of us across the board. But that's not enough. He's got that coach. Or that, the coach, the coach that, just kind of random, I guess, just luck. Yep. That you happen to meet that guy who takes you under his wing. And maybe the timing, like that was right around the time when you would come online as an athlete, when your body starts to develop, and socially when you can actually participate in sports and so on and so forth. And he gets pushed down another pathway that he wouldn't have otherwise taken.
No, that's exactly right. I think you bring up timing. So one of the I think the important contributions in the book is this distinction between, on the one hand, the adverse experiences, and on the other, how you respond to them. So one of the things to keep clear about here is they're often called ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, and we can come back to the history of that concept. But those are the experiences. So LeBron James had many adverse childhood experiences, and he had them during the early stages of life, where timing is actually the more detrimental, because so many of the critical circuits in the brain are being laid down and forged in the first kind of 5 years of life. So that early period, which was super disruptive to him, even though he had a mother who was there for him, were very disruptive in terms of exposure, moving from house to house, not having a father, hearing violence, and all the other things. He also is getting the experience with his coach, not only at a time that his body's developing, but critically, puberty. Puberty is a period where physiologically, in some ways, some of the key stress physiology resets itself, and where if positive experiences occur, it can really help reset the system, which effectively is what LeBron James experienced. Of course, if negative experiences happen, that's also kind of a critical, sensitive period where it can make things much worse. Let's bring in a recent topic. One of the things that I know you've had some people on your podcast who have talked a little about this. When COVID hit, that hit hardest to the teenagers, because the teenage years are effectively a critical period for social interactions. What COVID did is it stripped teenagers of social interactions. Social interactions are as important to teenagers as milk is to a baby. And so you've now deprived those children globally of key social interactions. So what we're seeing in schools and what everybody's kind of seeing in schools are children who are socially incredibly immature for their chronological age. How long it's going to take to catch up, no one knows. But a lot of the mental health problems that we're seeing, and I know your guests have talked about things like the cell phone culture and all these other things, but COVID in particular was a 2-year period of deprivation for teenagers. So timing is key.
I really think in future pandemics, which there will be, that has to be taken into account in the kind of policy decision making.
Totally.
There's a cost to keeping the schools open, a risk that the virus may spread through schools, but there's also a cost to closing the schools. So you have to weigh those, because at the time back in 2020, it was like, what the hell? Let's just close the schools. How bad could it be? Well,
that's right.
Turns out pretty bad. Yeah.
Pretty bad.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I would add that and this is also relevant, that so our youngest daughter was, in college and had to come home. FaceTime, Snapchat, those did nothing for her socially. I mean, it's probably better than nothing, but it did not solve the social interaction problem. And I think that's another important message is, a lot of the kids that we work in who are in alternative education programs due to emotional disabilities, traumatic experiences, they were just cloistered off. There was just no one. And what we saw when they came back was just really a sad situation, because these kids were starved for social interactions and they were completely deprived.
You do hear stories from athletes who use adversity as a weapon against their opponents. Like, this motherfucker is not going to take me down because I've been through so much shit. I'm going to draw on that and go. Right.
Yes.
Michael Jordan used to say, he would just make stuff up in his head about this guy over there just to get himself motivated.
Completely.
So yeah, again, why is some kid just, devastated and can hardly get out of bed, where someone else just says, I'm going to use this to drive forward and be successful?
I think again there's a very interesting line of research by a psychologist at the University of Utah named Bruce Ellis. And the concept is what he calls hidden talents. And the idea is that often from adversity can come these kind of hidden abilities that if we're not looking for them, we may miss them altogether. And so one of the ideas, for example, is because I know you're very interested in issues of bias. There's been some lovely research recently showing that individuals on the autistic spectrum are much less vulnerable to some of the kind of the cognitive biases that you and I would be vulnerable to. Sort of the famous cognitive reflection test, the ball and bat study. They don't fall victim to those as much. They seem to be much more focused on the details rather than kind of the contextual stuff that goes around it. So that's a case where the disability, in one sense, which is, of course, is in some ways can be seen as different ways of having social interactions, actually pays off in terms of kind of rational thinking. In the same way that children who are living in poverty, who often have to kind of scramble for resources, often have a much greater ability to do kind of divided attention. For most of us, if we're focused on this conversation and I'm also paying attention over here, I'm not really going to be focusing on this conversation. Whereas children who have grown up in poverty, scrambling for the resources, have actually fine-tuned a divided attentional system. So these are kind of hidden talents that can grow out of adversity. And so that's a very important line of research, because we tend to focus primarily on the kind of the disability, the negative aspects of what adversity does, rather than looking at what can change as a function of that. So again, another lens which brings in evolution, which is kind of very interesting as well, is there's been a tendency in kind of a medical model of trauma to just talk about the number of different types of adversity that kids experience. How many ACEs do you have? Sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, and so forth. But there's a very interesting line of work which suggests that we should think about different types of adversity shaping different ways of developing. For example, when all animals go through periods of deprivation or lack of resources, development tends to slow down. So you get individuals developing much more slowly when resources are poor. In contrast, when there are high threats like predation, threatening environments, development tends to speed up because you need to be able to have the skills to deal with the threats in your environment. That work that really started with animal work from an evolutionary perspective turns out to work out as well in human development. And so, again, thinking about how different types of diversity shape the developmental system is actually providing us with what I call traumatic signatures, ways of looking at the signatures of adversity that's going to better allow us to design interventions to help kids recover from the adversity.
Okay, just common underlying structures in the brain going on with behaviors. Teenage girls that become sexually promiscuous, teenage boys that become physically violent. Is this a self-control problem? The prefrontal cortex just doesn't fully develop because of what? The stress hormones block the full development, or what's going on in the brain with these ACEs?
Yeah, good. So the typical adverse experience that will often lead to kind of emotional dysregulation or lack of self-control are threatening situations: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, exposure to domestic violence, and so forth. What happens there is that the child has learned by being exposed to threat that the world is unsafe. And I'll just give a kind of a personal experience. I've had hundreds, but I'll just give you one. So this is a school I just started working in, middle school children who had emotional disabilities. That's what I knew about the school. And I walked into a classroom of about 10 to 12 children, about 9 to 11 years old. And as I walked in, this little boy bolts out of the classroom. I mean, just literally runs right out the door. And I'm like, whoa, what happened there? The teacher comes up to me and says, "Look, I'm really sorry, but you look like his father who beats him very frequently."
Whoa.
So, of course, that was heart-wrenching. And what that little boy had learned was exactly the right adaptive response. Anybody who looks like my father is garbage, and I'm going to get out of here because they're a threat to my existence. That was the right adaptive move. It's kind of like if you're a gazelle on the savannah and you see a lion who attacks you, you don't conclude that lion is bad. You conclude all lions suck, and you get out of there. So in contrast to most of teaching, which is generalizing beyond the examples that I instruct you on. So if I say to a young child, here's what the letter A looks like, and I happen to show them in Times New Roman font, they shouldn't learn that only Times New Roman is an A, that anything that looks like this is a letter A. So that's generalization. But in the case of abuse or threat, the child has in some ways misgeneralized, but it's an adaptive response. So what's happening is two things in terms of brain circuitry that we are beginning to understand better and better. One is the key area for kind of emotional valence processing, the amygdala, is on high alert. That system is now off and alarming all the time. The world is dangerous. The world is unsafe. But in addition to that, during development, the circuitry that connects that emotional system with the braking system, which is in the frontal lobe, is basically compromised and showing delays in development. So you've got a over-exuberant amygdala and an underpowered braking system. And that's what leads to potentially aggression, fleeing, running away, getting out of Dodge because the world is unsafe. And so two things happen or have to happen in order to give that child the ability to recover from that threatening world. One, that child needs to learn not to generalize to every man who looks like his father or her father. And so, for example, in my own case, the next time I came into the classroom, I walked in, I sat down on the ground, so I was smaller than him. I didn't look at him. I looked at the other children in the room and started talking and teaching them. And then the little boy comes up to me and goes, "What's the matter? You're not going to talk to me?" That was the beginning of erasing the threat. Okay. So you start calming that nervous system down so that he's now learning that not all men are like that. And you begin to give those children coping strategies so they can learn to better regulate their emotions when things are feeling threatening. So that's the kind of work that will often happen in schools, and that can happen in other organizations with children who've got traumatic experience that are due to threat, abuse, and so forth.
So would something like systematic desensitization that's used as part of cognitive behavior therapy be something like that you would use to help them discriminate between the bad guy and everybody else?
Yeah, so good. So therapeutic approaches are, of course, very, very, very important here. One of the things that I'm sure has been covered in some of the podcasts you've talked to your guests about is there's a massive mental health crisis. And that's not just obviously in the United States, it's everywhere. In a country like Kenya, there are only something like 3 child psychiatrists in the entire country. So imagine with a population that big, you've got 3 million orphans, not just the orphan population. You don't have the clinical technology, effectively, skill set to be able to do cognitive behavioral therapy and desensitization. So one of the things that I cover in the book, and I think this is an important piece of my book, is that it doesn't have a complete Western perspective. So it's not all the weird populations. I'm really trying to express what children experience across the globe. Just to give a statistic, the World Health Organization estimates that 1 billion children are maltreated every year across the globe. So this is a monumental number. And so cognitive behavioral therapy by a skilled therapist, of course, is elegant and successful and can help children desensitize and try to get to the root of what is causing the behavior. But for many people in the world, that's not going to be a tool that's available. So one of the things that I advocate for in the book and give examples of is really having a broad trauma toolkit, because we need different approaches, both for different types of traumatic experiences, for different age groups, and because of resources that are available in different parts of the world.
Yeah. In one of my lectures on determining causality, I talk about natural experiments. The kind of experiments you experimentalists cannot do. You can't force people to get divorced or smoke cigarettes or whatever. But you can see where it's been done. So I'm glad you talked about Ceausescu's Romanian program of banning all abortions, birth control, and rewarding women that had, 5 kids, and you were punished if you had less than 5.
Right. Tax
what
breaks,
could possibly go wrong? Well, we have a natural experiment. What happened there, and what do we learn from that?
Yeah, so of course that's one of the really sad periods of history, and some of your listeners may have seen the extraordinary 1990 Shame of a Nation ABC documentary, which really kind of blew the lid on what was going on in Romania to these children. It was, as it was described at the time, it was like seeing a Nazi concentration camp for little children. What was kind of very, very interesting about that period was 3 very distinguished developmental scientists were invited into the country to both learn what had actually happened to these children developmentally. So Charles Nelson, a good friend and colleague of mine, Nathan Fox and Charles Zena, all very distinguished developmentalists, went to Romania, and thus was kind of born the Budapest Early Intervention Project, which has now been running since about 1990. Many, many important lessons grew out of that. And really the understanding of what severe deprivation does to the child really grew out of that work. There were a couple things made just to note, very relevant to our conversation today. One of the big surprises, especially for these developmentalists who had been kind of trained in the tradition of early attachment theory, was that 10% of those children showed no attachment at all. This was a sort of a shock. At the time, everybody thought, well, attachment is kind of innate. I mean, there's no learning needed here, right? Mammals just attach. But what they were showing is that 10% of those children showed no attachment at all. They just no interest in relationships at all. So that was really a shock to the system. What also unfolded from their work was they kind of did a kind of a randomized control experiment in that some number of children were placed into foster care at different time periods during development. So some stayed in the orphanage, or what they called an institution, because of very institutional in terms of structure and resources, and some went into foster care. And what that allowed them to do was compare three groups: Romanian children growing up with their biological parents, Romanian children growing up as orphans within the orphanage, and Romanian children who had been in the orphanage for some period of time going into foster care. The big take-home message was that children who were placed into foster care at the age of about 2.5 years to 3 ultimately recovered almost all key cognitive, intellectual, social, emotional functions. So that really pointed to this idea of not just the type of adversity, but the timing of it. That if the first couple of years or so of life are neglect, deprivation, but then you're put into a nurturing environment, you can recover. Our daughter, who we adopted from a Russian orphanage, we adopted at 22 months, and I can happily say that she graduated from college and she's an absolutely lovely young woman. So it does seem like there's a critical period for these early experiences. However, and this is a really important result of something that does not seem to recover even with foster care: the core aspect of associative learning, of linking actions with consequences, such that good consequences motivate future behavior in that direction and bad consequences get you to do something different. That system seems to not recover, pointing to the fact that that early learning mechanism, which is about as fundamental as it can get for doing well in school and everything else, seems to really require that early experience if it's going to develop at all. And so that no one has yet found an early intervention that can cause that system to recover. And so that's one of the real tragedies of that result, is that early deprivation does not seem to recover under that kind of deprivation.
Yeah. Yeah, I read about that when I was writing about the abortion issue in terms of, this is long before Roe was overturned, the consequences of taking reproductive choices away from adult women. Before the birth control pill and before the modern era, that was infanticide, was quite rampant. And, now abortion has taken the place of that. If women don't want to have babies, they're not going to have them. And if you force them by law, they're just going to abandon them or just treat them poorly. Not out of hardness of heart. My favorite paper I read on that was hardness of life, not hardness of heart. That women are making choices about economic resources, not only currently, but for future children.
That's right.
This is kind of Trivers, what is it, parent-child offspring conflict and all that stuff. Of course, they're not making rational calculations here. They're just responding emotionally to the hardness of life, and that's mostly what you're talking about there. You must be worried about Ukraine now and future generations of what these children are going to be like.
Yeah, Ukraine and Gaza, of course. One of the great insights, and of course the devastating insights, comes from this woman I mentioned, Ruth Feldman, who's worked on the Israeli children who have been exposed to the conflict in Gaza. So she's focused on, of course, the Israeli side because she's an Israeli neuroscientist. One of the key results, and she's got many, but one that's worth sharing today, is that what exposure to war conflict does to the mother is it deadens the empathy system. And I want to push on this piece because one of the ways to think about the early parent-offspring relationship is like a tennis match. It's a serve and return relationship. Child serves up a need, parent returns the need. Now, when that's timely and well choreographed, the child's attachment grows strong because their communication, which may be a cry or lifting the hands up to be picked up, gets responded to. So it's a real communication, and it's like tennis in that it's timely. That doesn't mean that every child's need ought to be responded to. When the 3-year-old says, give me a smartphone, hopefully the answer is no, you are not going to get it. Some serves are clearly out of bounds. But when it works well and is timely, the attachment mechanism kicks into gear. And importantly, that sense of security allows that child to be curious about the world, explore the world, move away from mom and dad and explore. But importantly, that serve and return relationship is premised on an empathy system of a parent, that they kind of get what it's like to be the kid going, pick me up or look, right? If you deaden the empathy system, you're effectively killing the attachment system. And therefore, that child is now not getting the needs met. And that child now has never had it modeled what empathy is like. And now pro-social skills are going to be affected in that developing child. So you are potentially impacting generations by deadening the empathy system. And so that's not only worrying about pro-social, but how are you going to get perspective taking? How are people who are being on the Israeli side, who were hit by Hamas, now the Palestinian side from the Israeli response, how are they ever going to be able to take a perspective which is empathetic when that system has been completely kiboshed? And so I think these have long-term implications because the circuitry has been rewired in a way that is going to affect relationships, and that perspective-taking piece is key.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about John Bowlby's attachment theory. When it goes right, what does it look like? Is it kind of an imprinting thing, and you have the two parents, you have a safety base from which you can go out into the world secure and confident because you can always return to that secure base, that kind of thing, if I recall from Bowlby's theory?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's really the essence of it. I think, one of the things, and I'm keen to get your thoughts on this too, is as someone who's got, children and grandchildren now, I remember when my oldest daughter had children, so my grandkids, and I remember that because of their work schedule, those kids were going to go into a kind of a daycare really early in life. And I thought, this is just going to be a disaster. I mean, kids need their parents, for God's sake. And yet, of course, that turned out to be wrong. That there is a nurturing environment that can be there, that can do a wonderful job. And my grandkids are awesome. Not just because they're mine, but they're very well developed and they're very confident in who they are. But they were, 6-7 hours a day in a great daycare. So I think one of the things that I think I continue to challenge myself on is I think we don't really understand the potential of the human brain to adapt and change to different environmental circumstances. So when I hear, when your last guest, Abigail Schreier, talking about some of the bad therapy and social emotional, and I'm on the same page to a large extent, or Jonathan Haidt's Anxious Generation. Yes, but I want to hold out this, I think, faith and hope that the human brain has always had an incredible ability to change. Our environments have changed so much over millennia, and yet here we are. We haven't, clobbered the human species. The human species continues to adapt. And so when I think of core attachment, I think that there are critical relationships that build a sense of safety and security, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the parent. And let me tie this into some of the work that's going on in the children's homes or orphanages that we're working on in Kenya. The take-home message from the work in Romania was that, which is what happened in Eastern Europe, was that all the orphanages closed because they were seen as a disaster for child development. So they all closed. Interestingly, over the last few years, a group out of Duke University has done work on orphanages in low to middle income countries, Cambodia, Tanzania, Uganda, other places like that. And they've come to a slightly different conclusion about the nature of these orphanages, which is certainly what we've seen. In many of these children's homes or orphanages, you have a very high staff retention. Rather than the revolving door, which was true of the Romanian orphanage, there was never any stable caretakers. For these kids, they see the same staff day after day after day who become their aunties and their uncles and their grandparents and all the other things. They fill those roles in, and they provide consistency and support. And these kids thrive. Just give you one example. 2 years ago, I came to one of the children's homes, and there was a little boy who had been dropped at the doorstep, completely malnourished. He figures in the epilogue of my book, mute and malnourished. I thought, there's like no way. This kid was about 4 years of age. All the critical periods, many of them had gone past. Today, we put in a library in this children's home. This little boy has got bright eyes, alert, speaking, and reading. The growth has been
Albert, right?
Albert, spectacular growth. Consistency. Those staff loved him. They fed him. They nurtured him. He went to school. I mean, yes, N of one. But the point simply is that these children are in environments often where they're nurturing and there's consistency. And part of the dimensionality that I speak about in the book about adversity is that when adversity can really be damaging to the child is when it's completely uncontrollable and unpredictable. It creates that learned helplessness, which for children for anybody is a complete disaster developmentally. What these children home or orphanages are doing effectively is they're providing that predictability of resources and relationships, which is enabling recovery and growth.
By the way, do you know John Bowlby wrote a biography of Charles Darwin?
I do.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, if I recall, it was kind of applying attachment theory because Darwin's mother died when he was very young, and his father was kind of the stern authoritarian physician who worked all the time, wasn't around, so he's raised by his sisters, something like that, right? And they were kind of surrogate parents to him. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's interesting that, I mean, of course, you'd be interested as a historian. I mean, it was fascinating that Bowlby, of course, was in that entire environment of the early ethologists, Tinberg and Robert Hind. I mean, those were all people that were around. They were all interacting and growing together in some ways. So Pat Bateson was there, a great developmental biologist, all the imprinting work. So that group was really affected in that positive way. And in contrast, another character who appears in the book, of course, is Harry Harlow, affected by, Skinner and behaviorism, not ethology, and a totally different perspective on what he called love.
Yeah. Oh, that was the one with the wire mesh mothers. Yep. Yeah. I mean, you could not do that experiment today, much like you couldn't do Milgram's experiment or the Stanford prison experiment. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, so interesting on that. Yeah, my old evolutionary biology professor just died last week, Bayard Bradstrom, 92. He lived on a desert farm out in Arizona, but he studied lizard mating behavior, and he had this whole thing about how they bob. Different species have different bob patterns, like 2 up and then 1 long one and then 3 short ones and all this stuff. And I remember, and that was a behavioral reproductive isolating mechanism. Because if you don't give the right bob sequence, then you're not going to get a mate.
Correct.
Yeah, that was.
That's right. There's all those interesting things about species. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, he was part of that generation. So he built these little models. He had these like fish tanks but they were filled with sand, and then he had these little rubber lizards, and he had a little pulley thing and a little cam system that made the rubber lizard bob the correct sequence or the incorrect sequence. Anyways, really funny.
Exactly.
Yeah, those were crazy days. Yeah. So, okay, back to what was I going to say? Oh, yeah. So some of this is politicized.
Yes.
The nuclear family is the right way. You need two parents, and the mother should stay home because look what happens, when these kids go off to these horrible day care centers. And why are you hiring a stranger to raise your kid? And, women shouldn't have careers, or the other way, the Hillary, it takes a village.
Yes.
I guess it really, nothing is that simple, right? It depends on the village. It depends on the daycare. It depends on the parents at home when the kid comes home from the daycare.
Very much. No, very, very much so. And I think, in some ways that's the complicated piece, I think. Many of the children that we see in the schools here in the United States, and certainly the situation in Kenya, talk about totally different situations. But a lot of the children's homes or orphanages, as just an example, there's movement by different countries to stop them and have the kids go back to their families. But of course, for many of these kids, the family is the problem. And not everybody is going to be a good parent to be able to give the children what they need. So that's the first piece. We see tons of kids in schools where not necessarily because of bad parenting, but because the parents having to work 3 or 4 jobs, they just don't have the time for the kids. And so when those kids can go off to daycare and schools and be nurtured cognitively, emotionally, socially, then you find that development is going to work much better. But that puts a lot of pressure, of course, on the schools. And one of the things that we see is that, and this is maybe relevant to some of the topics that Abigail Schreier talked about with you in your last podcast, is that though I couldn't agree more that the tilt towards social emotional went too far. On the other hand, for a lot of these kids, they're not getting any kind of social emotional support or teaching at home, and they need it from somewhere. And so that's one piece I think is really important. In the same way that many parents don't have the time to read to their children, and so that cognitive intellectual development isn't going to happen in the home front. So what can happen in good schools and good daycares is to enrich those environments when they're not happening. So that's one piece. And I think the village concept, of course, is important in many different ways. One of the things we talk about in the book is that in many war-torn areas where, for example, children have been forced to go off to war and fight, or women who have been, young girls who have been raped, who are now seen as, damaged goods for their communities. The best way for recovery is for those villages and communities to come together to welcome those individuals back and see them as victims, not as the perpetrators. And so the villages are critical often in those cases of healing. So I think, again, this goes back to that trauma toolkit idea, is that we need various pathways to helping children develop in a healthy way. And I think one of the things that maybe was minimized in Abigail Schreier's book, which I like a lot, is that social skills don't just come for free. There's lots of individual differences. We know there's a lot of individual differences, for example, just in empathy. You probably know this one little study, but contagious yawning is something that's very much linked to empathy. And we know from studies of psychopaths and autism spectrum individuals that contagious yawning often doesn't happen, and lack of empathy seems to be part of those different disabilities. So empathy, in that sense, there's massive individual differences. And so those kinds of soft skills, for some, it's going to be needed to be in the school systems if they're not going to get them at home. So I think we want to be careful about, throwing the baby out with the bathwater and rejecting it as a kind of a bad move when it's going to be necessary in certain cases to do it so that kids get those skills.
Yeah, I just think social science is so hard to disentangle all the causal variables happening at one time. Another one of these politicized issues of systemic racism, the emphasis, I've been reading all these books, the emphasis seems to be on external issues of, like crappy schools and poor neighborhoods and the kind of thing government policies could do something about. But of course, the right pushes back and go, well, how about the home environment? How about upping your marriage rates and having more time with your kids and so on? Okay, so politicized, but surely it's both. And, if, what is it, 75% of Black children now are raised by single moms who have to work 2 or 3 jobs. You can't possibly expect them to go to the SAT test in high school and just be like ready to
That's
go,
right.
all prepped up and practiced and so on. And this goes back years in their lives. That has to have some effect. So talk a little bit about what we know about divorce and effects on children, not in these third world countries, but here in America. Okay, setting aside the 3 A's, right? Abuse, alcoholism, and adultery, so people should get divorced if this is the situation. But when should they stay together for the kids? Is this a good thing? Does it not matter? What do we know?
I mean, I think I think it's a great question. I think it's a complicated answer for the following reason. We know at some level what constitutes good experiences that children need to develop properly. And those fall under the sort of the topics of, cognitive stimulation, emotional stimulation, social stimulation, and practical physical stimulation, including things like food and so forth. So we can certainly, describe in detail what children need nutritionally to develop properly. And so that's one piece that's well understood. I think when it comes to the parenting piece, it so much depends on what any given parent gives that child. So if the environment, for example, is of a toxic relationship where that child is being exposed to abuse and violence among the parents and they're just sticking it out just for the child's sake, that is not healthy for that child. And so that is a case where anything they're doing to help support that child is going to be countervened by the toxicity of hearing parents yelling at each other or physically abusing each other in the home environment. So I think in cases where it's been studied, when that danger comes out to the child, that is a much better situation for the child developmentally than to have a child who's got both parents who are fighting. So domestic violence is in some ways as significant a threat to the toxicity of the child's development in terms of the stress physiology as is being kind of physically abused. So some of the work that's come out is suggesting that the impact on the immune system, the brain system, the autonomic systems are as impacted by a child being exposed to domestic violence as they are to being physically abused. And so that's in part answer to sticking it out versus cutting your losses and having the child be with a parent who can be healthy and with that child. So I think that's an important piece of this adversity. The other piece of it that I would add on is much depends on the timing of these things. And so, one of the lenses that, and we've talked about this already, is that it's not just the type of adversity. So let's take abuse as one and divorce or separation as another. It's also depending upon when it occurs. Those first 5 years of life are often the most vulnerable to the development of those 3 key systems: nervous, autonomic, and immune. And so if the adversity is coming from domestic violence during those periods, those are some of the most toxic ones to occur. I would add, and this is another part of development and marriage, we also are learning more and more about how mothers who are pregnant being exposed to abusive home environments from their husband, let's say, have a direct impact on the developing child. This is one, you talked about kind of natural experiments. This was a study that was done about a year or two ago based on work from what happened during Hurricane Sandy that hit the southern coast of the United States. What they did was they looked at mothers who were pregnant during Hurricane Sandy, and then they followed their children 5 years after that event and compared it with kids who were born before or kids who were born kind of, well after. What they found was that children who had been basically in utero during Hurricane Sandy, so extremely stressful for the mom, girls had a 5 to 6-fold higher anxiety and depression rate than comparison children at the age of 5. And boys had a 6 to 7-fold increase in ADHD and oppositional defiance. So just the stress impact, her physiology's impact on the developing fetus is showing up 5 to 6 years later in terms of mental health issues. So that just shows the impact of that stress. So a mother who's being abused by her husband, that stress, right, is also toxic to the developing child.
Incredible. Yeah. I forgot to ask you about the other element there. I mentioned teenage boys that get more violent, teenage girls that become sexually promiscuous. Why is that second one? You know, we know from evolutionary psychologists, women are far more risk averse. They're very careful. They're not high risk takers sexually. They're more selective of mates and so on. Is it the brake being taken off because we all have a sexual impulse, or is it, what's going on there?
Yeah, so I think there's two things, and I think the causal mechanism is a little bit less clear. Both physical abuse and sexual abuse are strongly associated with much higher emotional dysregulation, meaning weaker self-control. But the second thing is, and this is more just an association, is that individuals who are victims of sexual and physical abuse in childhood are much more likely to be victimized in adulthood. So there's a very strong, again, correlation between being victimized as a child and being re-victimized as an adult, physical and sexual abuse.
Because they don't have the skills to avoid the predators?
Avoid the predators, or recognize the cues, or put themselves in situations that are more risky. I think all those are factors that are leading to this kind of re-victimization. And so again, the risk-taking is another piece, right? More risk-taking, less self-control. Obviously, the teenage years are defined in some sense by greater risk-taking and impulse control. And there's these lovely neurobiological curves showing that, you know, the peak in risk-taking is hitting at around 16, 17 or so, whereas the peak in self-control is 23 to 25. So you have, I'm taking more risk at a time that I'm not really mature on my braking system. That's typical development. Trauma is going to stretch out that developmental curve for self-control. And that's a really important thing to think about. And it's had some very interesting policy implications. In Massachusetts, for example, just this year, they changed the age at which you can be given life without parole from 18 to 21. Now, as all my students have learned, high school students have learned this, they go, well, why wasn't it 23 to 25? I said, bingo, yeah, exactly. But at least it's a nod in the direction of this greater kind of maturation of these frontal functions, which is, allowing you to control better your behavior. But what the early trauma is going to do is it's going to push out that maturation even further, putting them more at risk of doing things that are risky for themselves, which may be the cause of that victimization.
Wasn't there a Supreme Court decision about the death penalty and the age at which it can be implemented nationally?
That I don't know about death penalty.
I'm trying to remember, because maybe it wasn't for all states, but I thought the Supreme Court had a case about that. Like you have to be 23 or something like that before a state can execute you. Not life without parole, but execution.
Yeah. It may well be. I mean, we're so barbaric at being the only one of the few countries with the death penalty.
I know.
But I mean, the age issues are very interesting because they've begun to shift in some sense, develop with legal issues as people begin to realize more about the developing brain. I mean, these are becoming more and more part of some legal decisions. I have a friend who's a criminal lawyer who's been telling me that cases of childhood traumatic experiences are becoming more kind of part of an argument. And of course, just like anything, either genetic or anything, justifying is much more difficult, which comes right back to your first, question, which is you can't pick out this guy as being the one who's going to do something bad just because they had that traumatic experience. But the more we understand about how early childhood potentially impacts later development, the more those cases become of interest. And, it's entering policy in other ways, some of which I think are not productive. But in California, your state, this work on ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, has become of insurance policy for Medi-Cal, for the low income individuals with Medi-Cal. I think, unfortunately, there's now a cutoff of certain numbers of ACEs, which gets certain kinds of insurance policy and others which do not. And I think that's a very deep misinterpretation of the ACE data, which is potentially having negative implications for individuals, even though, of course, it points to the importance of childhood adversity of impacting mental health. So and I talk about this at great length in the book because I think it's an interesting space where all these ideas about childhood adversity and trauma really require professionals to come together in different ways. We need law enforcement, we need judges, we need policy analysts, we need nurses and doctors and teachers and clinicians to come together with a kind of a common language and understanding, because they're all potentially affecting children.
Yeah. I want to ask you about another example from my causality lecture with counterfactuals. The thesis that boys that are abused as children grow up to become abusive fathers.
Yeah.
And you can find examples. Okay, what about the counterfactuals? Those who are abused as children that grow up to become loving fathers, or adult parents that were never abused that become abusive. What do we know about that whole area?
Yeah, I think the sort of the cycle of violence idea has been, to a large extent discredited. I think where it has become more interesting is that what we know about how an individual who as a child was maltreated in some way, how that can affect mental health later in life. So, for example, and we have lots of children that we work with where one or both parents were abused as children. They are not abusive, but they have things like depression and anxiety, which affects their parenting. So basically what you get in some cases is neglect. So it's not sort of tit for tat. I was abused and therefore I'm going to be an abuser, but I was abused or I was neglected. That affects my own well-being, or I've never had it modeled what good parenting is like. So I'm going to repeat how I was treated. So I think that's a much more meaningful and evidence-based understanding of what happens with childhood trauma, is how it leads to potentially parenting effects, which can be not good for the child. But I think, I was sexually abused, so I'll be a sexual abuser is not what we see. Of course, yes, there are cases, but there are many that are not. And I think, therefore, it's dangerous to draw that circle, that this is a perpetuating system that's just going to keep perpetuating the same kind of maltreatment of the child. But what we do need to be clear on is a child who is born to a parent with trauma that has never been dealt with, there may be negative consequences for that developing child, and especially in terms of neglect.
Yeah. Maybe transition now to what to do about it, the hopeful part of your book. It through that example that Abigail and I talked about of the Matt Damon film, Good Will Hunting. Where they were both abused, the Robin Williams therapist and the Matt Damon kid, they were both sexually abused as children, and they finally hug it out at the end, and he says, "It's not your fault, I know. It's not your fault, I know. It's not your fault." What? And they hug it out and cry, and then he's cured. And of course, Abigail's point was, it doesn't work that way. But how does it work? What can we do with cases like that?
Well, so I think, I'll maybe just touch upon sort of the last chapter, which I think is sort of some of the exciting frontiers. I don't talk a lot about therapy in the book, not because I'm not a fan of therapy, but because I think that's the part which has been in some ways talked about the most. And of course, for some people, therapy is an absolute revolution for them and a cure for their ills. And so, I don't want to minimize that role. What I want to note, however, is two things. One is qualified therapists are certainly not something that are globally available. And we know how taxed our own therapeutic system has gotten here. On the Cape where I am, there's one child psychiatrist who I believe his caseload is something like 300 kids. Like, there's just no way those kids are getting treatment in any kind of way that could be possibly serious. Counselors in colleges were completely overwhelmed, and certainly are now with all the things going on campuses that kids are being harmed by. They're totally overwhelmed. So I think we just have to be clear about what role is possible with therapy. But where I've gotten interested in is a kind of a little mini revolution that's happening in another area, which I kind of lumped under the topic of neuroengineering, which are ways to basically directly kind of treat both the autonomic and nervous systems. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. Some of your listeners will surely be aware of kind of the happenings around psychedelics. And what I think is really potentially very important about that research, which has really matured greatly over the last 10 to 15 years, including since Michael Pollan's book, which really kind of pointed a spotlight on it journalistically, is that, first of all, it's therapy-assisted psychedelic treatment. So people aren't just going on an LSD trip and having fun. It's being guided by a trained therapist with a particular style of therapy. So that's the first thing. It's therapy-assisted psychedelics. The second thing is that it's not just any old psychedelic, and it's not any old mental health issue. So, for example, psilocybin with therapy is being used to treat major depression, and MDMA or ecstasy is being used with therapy for PTSD, often complex PTSD. What I really like about this research, and of course it's like anything, it's got ways to go, is that they've done some of the best scientific experiments to understand what's going on. So they're sort of doubly blind, and they're doubly blind in the following way. Patients don't know if they're getting placebo or the psychedelic, and therapists don't know who's getting the placebo and psychedelic. So it's doubly blind. That's beautiful. Okay. Secondly, and I'll just focus on PTSD, and the results are pretty similar in terms of impact on major depression, is that they are looking at patients who have been what are called treatment resistant, meaning that neither therapy nor medication, traditional medication like SSRIs, have worked for these people for anywhere from 10 to 14 years. So these are people who have truly been suffering for a very long time with PTSD. So they're having nightmares, they're having dissociation, loss of identity, emotional dysregulation, all the classic kind of symptoms associated with PTSD. Some of it are veterans, some of it is from childhood trauma, a variety of things, but with a diagnosis, PTSD. The result from the most recent work, which is probably going to launch them into FDA approval, is that you get approximately 70% who have lost the PTSD diagnosis. I mean, that in any kind of area of psychology that I know of is like a home run. I mean, that is beyond belief, right? It's not 1,000 individuals. Maybe it's about 100 individuals. It's not, all the diversity of people you might want, but it's 100 individuals with treatment-resistant PTSD with a very well-controlled experiment. Okay, so that is one example of something that to me gives me hope of another toolkit in the trauma toolkit. Okay, the second one I want to point to, which I also really like, and again, because the technology has advanced for many, many years now, it's a technology that I used in some of my research called transcranial magnetic stimulation. So this is basically a magnetic coil which is put onto the skull. It's like a pluck to your head. That's what it feels like. And when you do repeated transcranial magnetic stimulation, what you effectively do is create kind of a temporary lesion. That area can effectively be turned off for a period of time while you're being stimulated. Okay, so here's what they did. In this experiment, and just like in the psychedelics, you have a kind of a sham treatment where you're hitting a different part of the brain a person doesn't know. But the target area is an area well known to be involved in visual imagery. Okay? So you take people who've experienced visually traumatic experiences, a car accident of a parent, somebody shot in front of them, something that's visually overwhelming, like war veterans, where those visuals continue to come back and haunt the individual and, of course, are debilitating. Okay? There are many, of course, traumatic experiences that don't have those visuals. A child living in poverty, it's horrible and devastating for that child, but the visuals aren't what's dominating it. So what you do with these people who have those visually traumatic memories that come back to haunt them is you invite them to have them again while they're under TMS stimulation. And while they're having it, you are hitting that area of visual imagery. And the result they get is you don't lose the memory that you had the traumatic experience, but the visual memory goes away. It's like an eraser. And that allows for better functioning. Okay. I love that because that is an elegant use of the brain sciences of, decades going back to Steve Kosselin's early work on visual imagery to pinpoint an area known to be involved in visual imagery that is ultimately what's harboring part of those traumatic memories. And it's basically like an eraser buffering that system so that when you recall it, you're just not flooded with that image. So that is to me, a powerful potentiality of a system that could be used. And of course, the TMS system has been FDA approved for depression. So it's already begun to make its way into the clinical area. And this, I think, is just yet another step in that direction.
That's incredible. So is the visual memory gone? It's really erased or just softened or weakened or whatever the right word would be?
Weakened is probably the better expression. I think I say kind of, in the book, something like, it's erased where you can see a trace. So it's not like you can't, have any of it gone. It's a real open question, of course, is what it would take to do that. But I think the important piece, because of course there are really some ethical issues here about us playing God and erasing memories, right? This is like Black Mirror. We want to be careful there because it could be misused. But the interesting piece here is that when you have clinically verifiable cases of PTSD linked to these visual images, it's what kind of stimulation protocol would you need to effectively knock out the visuals, but maintain the memory of the experience.
Yeah, but of course, you only want to do this if it's an extreme case where the person can't even function, can't hold a job, can't keep their marriage together.
Correct.
And so on. We're not talking about you and I doing this. We don't want Timothy Leary as our therapist.
No.
I'm going to drop hazard. Yeah.
Exactly.
So, really, it's reminds me of Clockwork Orange, Stanley Kubrick's first film.
Yes.
Where this was pure Skinnerian behaviorism, but the attempt again is on this scoundrel who just was out of control, and there was no other measures to take there.
Do you remember, Michael? Do you remember the story of Anthony Burgess and Kubrick's movie about the book?
Well, I read the book and saw the movie, but I don't know the backstory of their.
So the backstory is fascinating in terms of what we're talking about. So Anthony Burgess, that was his first novella. And when he sent it, it was a hit in Europe, in England. But when he sent it to the United States, the editors said, look, we don't like this last chapter. So if you really get rid of the last chapter, we'll publish it here. So he did. Kubrick did the movie based on the American version. The last chapter is chapter 21, where Alex comes of age and stops his violence.
Really? Oh. I just grew out of it. Oh, that's wild. No, I did not know that. Okay.
And 21, of course, was timely, right? Chapter 21, right? It wasn't a random 21. So it's a fascinating story about his insight into kind of development in some sense.
Now, in terms of these treatments for kids versus the soldiers, could it be the soldiers are responding because, for the first 18 years of their life, they were normal, and then they had 6 months of a horrible tour, and so it's easier to make that bad memory get erased or weakened versus if you had 6 years of that from 0 to 6, say, it would be a different outcome?
Yeah. So that we do not know. In the MDMA case, it was a mixture of people who had adult traumatic experiences and some who had childhood traumatic experiences. I don't think they have the power statistically to disambiguate those populations yet, at least. In the case of the TMS study, these were adults who had a variety of different kinds of traumatic experiences. So again, underpowered in terms of population separation. That's where the research really is. We don't have enough power with these studies. Again, they're expensive, and just like the imaging studies, where they're often underpowered, and so understanding statistical variation within the population is difficult. Again, I think we got to be very careful here. You may be aware of this. There was a recent study that was done as sort of a meta-analysis of imaging work in visual processing. So the visual cortex, of course, is kind of the most understood part of the brain we have. I mean, part due to non-human primate work, but also human work. And there was a kind of a failure to replicate across studies, even doing the same kind of analyses. And so even with a basic system like visual processing, some of the imaging studies have been clearly underpowered. And so we definitely have to be careful here. Don't have enough heterogeneity in the population. Again, going back to your original question to say, this is the toolkit for this profile, this is the toolkit for that profile. We're not there yet.
Yeah, I think we have a long ways to go. One of my favorite books in this whole topic was Adrian Rain's book, The Anatomy of Violence,
Yes.
in which he talks, in the long term, maybe in a century or two, we'll have that kind of toolkit within a super advanced 23andMe or whatever they give to every kid in the school or whatever.
Right.
But he had two examples in there that I've written about that I find interesting. One was Mr. Oft, OFT, the gentleman with the orbital frontal cortex tumor, who was a normal middle-aged guy who suddenly became inappropriate with children, and he kiddie porn on his computer, touched his stepdaughter inappropriately, and he's a pedophile, right? So then he's in big trouble with the law, and then they scan his brain because he's acting really weird, and he pees his pants standing there in court or whatever. They go, this guy's not normal. Yeah. He's got a tumor in his orbital frontal cortex. He's not a pedophile. He's a medical patient. He has a brain tumor. So they take the tumor out. He doesn't have the feelings anymore. And then there was the second case, Donta Page, the young African-American man who killed that student in Colorado. And he was on trial for, he was convicted, and then should he get the death penalty or life in prison? So Adrian Rain was on the defense side saying, well, here's his background. So you read like 3 pages in his book of this poor kid's background. It's like every story you've told in your book. Just it's the worst possible luck you could ever have to be this poor kid. And by the end of it, you sort of feel bad for him. And then Adrian says, but by the way, let me remind you of what he did. Is like, oh, God, don't ever let this guy out. Right. So then I got to thinking about this. I remember telling my wife about this. It's like, there's no brakes, so the impulses are just bubbling up. And she says, well, you don't have those impulses, do you, that you have a brake? I go, well, no, actually, I don't. That's true.
Yeah.
What are the impulses? Why would you want to suddenly have sex with a child? It never occurs to me, whether I have a brake or not, it's not going to happen. Or just beat the crap out of somebody and kill them just for the fun of it.
Yes.
But for the brake, I would do this. No, I wouldn't. So is it the brake?
That's
is
right.
it the gas pedal? What are your thoughts on all that?
I think the individual difference issue is really interesting, and I think there are cases that go in all the directions that you'd kind of expect. So I remember just on the brain piece, actually when I was doing some work with some neurosurgeons at Harvard Medical School, one of the neurosurgeons, I was going to visit her, and she said, hey, you got to see this patient I just had. This guy came in to us, a few weeks ago complaining of a really severe headache. And we did all sorts of neuropsychs on him, and nothing showed up as abnormal. Look at this scan. In the right hemisphere, about the size of my fist, was a tumor that was squeezing his right hemisphere into his skull. I bet that's big. They removed the tumor, and it pops back in. This guy showed no cognitive deficits. Okay, so that's a physical abnormality like you've never seen before. Okay, so that's one case. Second case, and this is where I think our understanding of not just the nervous system, but the autonomic and immune system are really critical for understanding what can go wrong. So one of the cases of a woman who contacted the original doctor who did these important studies in 1998 called Dr. Vincent Felitti and these ACEs studies, so adverse childhood experiences. She contacted him and said, look, I'm really thankful to you about having seen your work and the importance of childhood trauma. I am right now a Seventh Court Circuit judge. When I was a child, my grandfather pimped me out at saloons as a child. So I was basically sexually abused my entire childhood. But I'm a Seventh Court Circuit judge. However, I'm also sitting on 4 different types of cancer. So her immune system was completely and utterly compromised. She had been sexually abused kind of relentlessly and horrifically. She became a judge. So at one level, her ability to rise above was great, but she was compromised physiologically. And I think this is part of the lesson, that it can pop up in different parts of the system. So she was chronologically, 56 years old, but biologically she was like 80. And so the system was compromised. And so I think how these things pop out are due to some of these fundamental individual differences, right? So yes, you're not going to be someone who's going to be a pedophile, right? That's not the direction that's going to happen when things break for you. You've had your traumatic experiences, we all have, right? For some of us, it may just push us right over the edge, and we may do things behaviorally that we regret. I don't know if you've seen it. There's a wonderful video, deeply emotionally sad, woman who's working in San Quentin, and she brings all these prisoners who have, I think, lifetime, no parole. And she stands in the middle and she says, if you were physically abused as a child, step forward. And they all step forward. If you were emotionally neglected, step forward. And she just goes through all the aces. And before you know it, like, they're literally all around her. And they all just start sobbing because they all realize this is a shared experience. They all thought they were unique, but that's not unique. And I think that's the important message. And yet, some people have the capacity to self-control the toxic experiences they've had. That may pay off in terms of certain kinds of functioning, but keeping things under wrap also can aid you. The physiology of pushing down that stress bubble, right, is something that we know has these epigenetic effects. It has these strong autonomic and immune effects. And so I think that's part of the lesson of what we've learned, is that the 3 systems can be hit in different ways, and they can lead to health issues that we need to understand and recognize.
Yeah. Well, that was Adrian Rain's other point about Donta Page. There was nothing on the brain scan that looked like a tumor where you could point to it and go, that's the problem. How do you take 20 years of a horrible background and see it on a scan? We're not there yet.
We're not there yet. And in both directions, it was like, Albert Einstein had a slightly smaller parietal area.
Oh, right.
Really? Is that it? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Last a point that we'll wrap up here. So I was thinking about Robert Sapolsky's new book, Determined. So he was on the show.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk about the free will determinism issue, but the policy issue, what you do about these cases. In this case, he opens the book with a story of, he's at the Stanford University graduation. I think it was his son or daughter graduating. And of course, he's proud. All the parents there are proud. And then off in the background, he sees a gardener, just picking up leaves or whatever. And it's like, how come that guy is not graduating from Stanford University? How come he's a gardener? And then he, deconstructs that for the rest of the book. There's 500 different things that lead you down this pathway, and you end up being a gardener rather than a Stanford University superstar, right?
Yeah.
And, but what do we do about that, right? I mean, not everybody can go to Stanford, so there's variation in intelligence and a need of achievement and all the big 5 how conscientious you are and so on and so forth. I guess what we want as a society is a fair society where you're not held back. It's not that I'm privileged because I'm white. This is how I describe this. That being white and having just access to things and nobody holding me back, that should be the default, right? That's the Rawlsian society, just society. And so I guess my question for you is, given all this research, from a policy perspective, what can the government do? Like, more funding for research on this area of abuse or treatment of it? Is this part of the National Institutes of Health, or just the HMO systems and what gets treated? And, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'll give a slightly more narrow answer just because of my own experience. I think, I live in a state which is consistently been one of the top states in the country for education. And yet I look at the pressure on teachers to teach kids, especially in special education where you have these, very difficult children who have had different experiences and so forth. The teachers are taxed and they often don't have the resources to be able to help. And of course, salaries are not great for teachers. On a school level, I think there needs to be much greater support for teachers because teachers are often a key interface for a lot of the enrichment that is the unequal part of people's environments. And so I think schools could serve a much stronger role in developing children who have an unfair background due to whatever reasons. So that's one. And I think, again, we come to think about sort of specifically the trauma area, there needs to be, I wouldn't say more research. I would say we need to have more education of the people involved in helping children grow and recover from these things because the education is not there. Most of the material that I cover in my book, which is embedded in the sciences, in scientific journals, is not in the hands of the practitioners. And that includes doctors, by the way. I'd say 50-60% of doctors I've ever talked to about adverse childhood experiences and the impact on the body and brain don't know the literature. That's very, very sad that's the case. I know you recently talked about sort of Tom Insel's comment about him dedicating all this money into mental health at the NIH, and it hasn't really led to much progress. I think it's less about investing in research than leading to skills and knowledge of the staff who are working with kids. I have this one line in the book, which can be treated as kind of a more negative, narrowly pessimistic view, which is that I don't think humans are ever going to get rid of adverse childhood experiences. The landscape is such that we always will have them somewhere in some places in the world. No one thought war in Europe. We of course expected probably a war again in the Middle East, but those are conflicts that are going to keep happening. Poverty, disease, COVID wasn't expected. So we need to be building more resilient individuals who can hopefully work through the adversity or recover from it. And I think that's really a skill thing. There are techniques that are out there. They're just not in enough people's hands.
Perfect place to end it. Here it is, Vulnerable Minds. Get this book and send it to your local senator and say, we need more money for this research. The harm of childhood trauma and the hope of resilience